Welcome to Lecture 10. Today we're discussing Mesmerism as it related to natural science and the French Revolution. We have in English the word mesmerize. It means to fascinate or to hold spellbound. Also means to hypnotize. Franz Anton Mesmer was a physician who lived from 1734 to 1815, and he knew how to hold people spellbound. He did this in the course of treating them as a physician, and he did it in the name of science. Mesmer believed that he had come up with a new discovery that would revolutionize medicine. He tried to convince the natural philosophers in the Paris Academy that there was this imponderable fluid that flowed through the body. That's what we're going to learn about today. But right now, let me back up a bit. In this lecture, we're going to continue our investigation of medicine in the 18th century. Last time in Lecture 9, we learned that the general understanding of health during this time was, as it had been for a long period, maintaining a balance in the body, keeping an equilibrium among the body's four humors, black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. And don't let anything get in the way of the normal balance that should exist among these six non-naturals: fresh air, food, exercise, sleep, excretion, and passion. Disease occurred when the normal equilibrium among these factors was disturbed in some way. We met the great variety of healers that graced the landscape of the century, and we noted how easily people who were sick could cross the lines that marked one healer off from another in their search for treatment. And we ended last time with an observation about how medicine was about to change as the 19th century progressed. We noted that at the end of the 18th century, it was a pivotal time for the history of medicine. It paved the way for what emerged later, well into the new century, what became known as scientific medicine. What would this scientific medicine look like? Well, not too long ago, a historian of medicine looked particularly at the period from 1770 to 1820, precisely this time when medicine was beginning to undergo its transformation. This is also exactly the time when the notion of being scientific was itself emerging, as we noted. I'll have a lot more to say about that in a later lecture, but the point here is that medicine was sharing in something that was bigger than just medicine, something that was happening across the boards. Anyway, back to the historian of medicine I mentioned, he concluded that one mark of the new scientific medicine, when it had finally become established by the middle of the 19th century, was that it had a validated theory from which it claimed to derive concrete practices. Scientific physicians could say, here's our theory of what causes disease. It's been tested and verified, and because we know it to be true, we know what to do about disease. We know how to treat it. We know what specific steps we should take in dealing with it. Now, a great part of this theory, incidentally, was the germ theory, the idea that there are microorganisms that are responsible for diseases. If you were convinced of that, you would then seek out the germs, which would take some good old laboratory gut work, and learn how to destroy them. Once the science was done, once the pharmacists could develop a medicine, the physician could then learn to associate certain symptoms with certain germs and prescribe the medicine. Now, we all know that medicine isn't quite that simple. Would that it were. But I have to say that the picture I just painted isn't that far off from what medicine is still supposed to do in our own day, at least in the ideal case. We're still always on the lookout for magic bullets to cure disease, however unrealistic that attitude might turn out to be in practice. The point is, this is the image that scientific medicine has. There's a theoretical knowledge that dictates what medical practice should be. Now, we didn't have this kind of situation in the medical practices I described last time. Yes, there was a general theory. Disease comes from imbalance, from a disturbance of a normal equilibrium. But that theory by no means dictated a concrete practice that everyone agreed on. That's one reason why there were so many different kinds of healers. They were all pretty much agreed about what caused disease, but they certainly did not agree about what to do about it. Oh yes, there were no doubt lots of cases of validation of the theory, but these were by and large anecdotal. there wasn't a general consensus about practice. And that was in large part because there wasn't a consensus about how to validate what theory there was. Well, today we're going to examine an early attempt prior to the 19th century, and therefore prior to scientific medicine, to associate medical practice with natural science. It came about in the work of a German physician named Franz Anton Mesmer. Mesmer wanted to get in on the attention that natural science was receiving. We've learned a great deal already in this series of lectures about how natural science was making itself known in the latter half of the 18th century. A lot was happening in astronomy, in geology, chemistry, natural history. Also in a brand new area, electricity. We'll look at that next time. It was all quite exciting. Mesmer wanted to get in on it. And he thought he knew how to make medicine scientific. Alas, his attempt was doomed to failure. Mesmer's wish to join the natural scientists failed, in my view, for two main reasons. First, and most important, there was no consensus yet about what being scientific meant. This is ironic in some ways, since there was so much happening, but don't make the mistake of assuming that all the activity I just mentioned in astronomy and so forth, that all of it was different in the minds of most folks from activities we might today call pseudoscience. Yes, chemistry was separating itself from alchemy, but that was in process. Well, a lot of work was happening where the understanding of nature and its laws was concerned. There still was no consensus about what it all had to do or what it all had in common. So if there was no established consensus about what being scientific meant, there certainly was no consensus about what a science of medicine ought to look like. The second reason why Mesmer was not going to succeed was because his assertions were made in a highly politicized context, the years leading up to the French Revolution. Being controversial is one thing. Being controversial when society is under pressure, when the basis for social stability is being fundamentally questioned, when emotions are running high, when the authorities are nervous, when the public order is in jeopardy, well, that's another matter. If Mesmer wanted to increase his status in the established order of his day, that was going to be very hard to do if the establishment saw him as a threat. Now, some of you might be thinking, wait a minute, what about the claims he was making? Aren't we going to consider whether they were true or false? Why can't we start there? Why can't we explain his failures simply as a matter of his claims being shown to be wrong? We'll examine the question of his claims and how they were tested. What's really fascinating about this question is that it gets complicated by the presence of that other new science I mentioned, electricity. Much about Mesmer's theory resembles other theories of the day, and this was particularly true where electricity was concerned. In other words, if you say that the Academy showed Mesmer's imponderable fluid did not exist, that his theory was simply crazy, and that we understand his failure primarily for that reason, then you're going to have to come up with a pretty good and long explanation why electrical fluid was accepted, why phlogiston was accepted as real. They were also imponderable fluids that were part of the landscape of scientific activity in this era. So it gets complicated. We have to ask what the perceptions of the people of the day were, not what ours might be. And there, a lot depends on who's talking. We're going to see in this wonderful story that there are those who begin to assume that they speak for natural science. That will be a very definite component of the eventual emergence of a scientific community when it happens later, that there are those who are acknowledged as its spokesmen. And in the initial formation of the community, they were men. So, who was Franz Mesmer? Well, he was born in 1734 in a village on the Bodensee. He came from rather humble social origins. His father was the forester for the Archbishop of Constance. No doubt not an educated man, but not young Franz. He was going to be educated. He went off to the Catholic school in Constance and later attended a Jesuit school there. The Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, had long been devoted to scholarship and teaching and the Jesuits gave Mesmer a good education. When he was 16, he went off to a Jesuit university to study philosophy and theology in preparation for the priesthood. This was important because part of what he studied included mystical and magical traditions. When he was 20, Mesmer decided that he wanted to study more philosophy. So the next 5 years he spent doing that at a different university, this one in Ingolstadt in Bavaria. This was the first time he encountered criticism of the Jesuits. That happened when he was exposed to the rational philosophical system of Christian Wolff, the follower of Leibniz we met in Lecture 8. Some of the professors who taught him Wolff's philosophy were critical of Jesuit thought, so his horizons were broadening. Pursuing university education like he did meant that he clearly had left behind the kind of world his father, the forester, knew. He was going to move farther up the social scale than that. Around age 25, Mesmer decided to go to Vienna. And this is where things finally began to come together for him. Eventually, he came to the decision to study medicine, and he finished his degree when he was 32. That's a bit late for someone of the time to get a medical degree. But then Mesmer had come a long way from his roots to this point. I should note that he got his medical training from the students of Hermann Boerhaave. Boerhaave was that Dutch Newtonian physician who was so influential on Albrecht von Haller, the Preformationist we met back in Lecture 8. Boerhaave influenced a lot of students in the 18th century. They took up his insistence on doing experiments and passed it on to their students. They also passed on Boerhaave's firm conviction that to understand the body, you had to know its mechanical operations. And they passed all this on to Mesmer, who learned it well. So Mesmer's now a physician in Vienna. I mentioned last time that being a physician could be tough, especially at the beginning of a career. Here's where Mesmer was different from others. He was in his early 30s and just starting out as a physician. So what does he do? Well, he marries up. He marries a wealthy widow, one Maria Anna von Posch. That helped enormously. Gave him immediate entry into Viennese society of the late 1760s. We have to conclude that Mesmer was the kind of personality that was up to this. He must have been charming enough in his own way to pull it off. What we do know is that his house became a meeting place for wonderful social occasions, and with a twist. Often the people who came were the kind that were interested in the sciences and the arts. Music was a real focus. Young Wolfgang Mozart was often there. We're told that Mesmer himself played a number of instruments, including the glass harmonica. That instrument would be his first link to Benjamin Franklin, who invented one in the early 1760s. It would not, however, be the last link between them, as we'll see. Mesmer's rise to high society, however, was not what brought his name into the English language. He became famous because of his new ideas in medicine. So what was Mesmer's understanding of health and disease? It was unusual, to say the least, but not so unusual that it wasn't accepted by his medical professors. Mesmer began developing an idea already in the dissertation he presented for his degree, and he defended the dissertation successfully in 1766. His idea was that there was a planetary force that affected the innermost matter of living things. He called it animal gravity, clearly drawing on the parallel force that Newton had claimed existed between the Earth, the Moon, and the planets. This was a different force from Newton's, and it interacted differently. First, it interacted only with living things. In fact, it interacted with the tiny parts of living things that were so fine that they no longer qualified as matter. Mesmer regarded these innermost parts of living things as an imponderable fluid. It was, he said, like the matter of light. Everyone knew that light affected living things. Now, Mesmer decided that under normal conditions, this imponderable fluid flows unimpeded through living things. That's when they're healthy. If the flow is blocked, he said, that's when illness results. We see here a mixture of the old and the new. What's old, what's familiar, is that if a normal equilibrium is upset, you can get sick. What's new is the thing that's getting upset. It's a new kind of fluid in the body, one of the new imponderable fluids that natural philosophers were talking about. Mesmer claims this new fluid is the medium that responds to a force from the planets he calls animal gravity. Now, Mesmer was quick to point out that animal gravity can affect individuals differently. There are a lot of variables in individuals, he said, age, sex, temperament, to name just a few. That's why animal gravity can affect individuals differently. He referred to music to make his point. It's just like a stringed instrument. The string responds only to the tone with which it's in harmony. And he had no doubt at all about the animal gravity. Look at the moon's influence, he said. Everybody knows that the moon and its phases affect people. If you need evidence of the need for unimpeded harmony between the microcosm and the macrocosm, there you have it. Now, all this was in his dissertation in 1766. After a few years had passed, Mesmer became convinced that a better analog for the action of the force that he'd called animal gravity in his dissertation was in fact not gravity after all. It was the action of magnetism. The basics of his theory remained the same. The imponderable fluid in the body interacted with an all-pervasive force of the cosmos, but now it was the action of a magnetic force, not a gravitational force, that made more sense to him. He no longer talked about animal gravity. Now he spoke of animal magnetism. Animals possessed a medium for the flow of magnetic force. The question was, could the physician learn how to affect the body by controlling the magnetic force, by directing it to where it needed to be? Whatever the reason for the change from gravity to magnetism, Mesmer procured several magnets from the professor of astronomy at Vienna and began in the 1770s to treat patients using his new theory. One young woman who came to him suffered from frequent convulsions. They in turn caused her severe pain in her ears and gave rise to delirium and vomiting and fainting. Mesmer concluded that the normal magnetic flow was being blocked. He used magnets that he had gotten hold of to restore the flow of what he now called animal magnetism in the young woman. And it brought the convulsions to a halt. Obviously, he'd been right. The problem was due to a blockage of the normal flow of the magnetic force through the body. The imponderable fluid of the body that served as the medium for the flow had been obstructed, and Mesmer had been able to use the magnets to redirect the flow and remove the blockage. Then he found that he could elicit tremulous responses from the woman without touching her with the magnets. In fact, he didn't have to communicate the magnetic force by contact at all. He could direct the force by pointing. This was bound to generate skepticism among his medical colleagues, and it did. So he brought one of them to witness the responses for himself. Now he's really on to something. So Mesmer works out a whole system for his theory. It listed various points on the body that were key loci for applying magnetic force when removing blockage and restoring an unimpeded flow of the animal magnetic force. One can just imagine the general interest these ideas caused as more and more people heard about them. Well, what was the response to these claims as the word got out? Naturally, his initial success in Austria led to a certain amount of fame. After all, he's a known figure in Vienna society, so his opinions were worth something right there. And everyone knew of his interest in the latest developments in the natural sciences. Many took his theory itself to be one of these latest developments. I think this was why Mesmer was consulted by one of the leaders of the Catholic Enlightenment about a claim being made in Bavaria at the time. The head of the Theatinerkirche in Munich brought Mesmer in as an expert in 1775 to evaluate the claims of a priest named Father Johann Gastner, who was going around healing folks through exorcism. Mesmer saw what Gastner could do, then used animal magnetism to produce the same reactions in people as Gastner had. His official judgment: Gastner's belief in the devil was theologically confused self-deception. Now, this is really interesting because Mesmer regarded his explanation as a rational understanding of the mechanistic forces of nature. What he was doing involved real physical processes, and he wanted to distance himself from those who appealed to evil forces or the occult and magic. For all that, Mesmer's approach was still very unconventional. And when you're unconventional, you're bound to ruffle feathers. We won't be surprised then to discover that Mesmer's approach elicited some hostile reactions among many in socially established institutions. They didn't like the attention he was getting, and they didn't like the kind of explanation he was offering. It was too different. One case in particular made it impossible for Mesmer to stay in Vienna. In 1777, he consented to treat a young girl of 18 named Maria Theresa Paradis. She'd gone blind overnight when she was just 3.5 years old. Now, as a teenager, she hadn't responded to any treatment, and she'd tried them all. She'd even been treated with that other new power that was drawing all kinds of attention, electric shocks. No effect. The doctors declared her unhealable. There was something else about Fräulein Paradis you should know. She was a terrific pianist. The king's wife had taken an interest in her and helped her obtain training. Naturally, the fact that this young blind woman could play so well gave her a certain celebrity. Well, Mesmer decided he'd try his hand at helping the girl. And he made some progress, too. Mesmer's magnetic treatments helped her regain some sight. But with success came a downside. Now that she could see a little, she became disoriented when she played the piano. She was no longer as secure as when she was blind. She could play better then. Now her father becomes upset. Other doctors are called in. Eventually, Mesmer's treatments are cut off, even though Maria herself protested. She relapsed into blindness. Her ability to play the piano did return, but now she was blind again. The whole episode had been quite an ordeal. The father began to make accusations against Mesmer. He had deceived his daughter. He had also exposed her to mistreatment just so he could conduct some experiments. And then came the inevitable rumors about a possible relationship between Mesmer and the young woman. The fact that young women appeared more responsive to Mesmer's treatment does lend a gendered quality to this whole historical episode. I guess we can see from all this that public scandal is not just a thing of the present. Well, Mesmer was finished in Vienna, so he decided to leave. He'd go to Paris. That was the center of scientific activity. Surely the savants in the academy would be willing to validate his theory. So he went to Paris in 1778, and it wasn't long before he was invited to outline his theory to the academy. But to his surprise, the academicians ignored him. Mesmer was obviously frustrated by this rebuff, but what could he do? What else but set up a local practice and start seeing patients? It wasn't long before he had a thriving practice, and Mesmer improvised as he went. He started receiving people in groups, and he began using new tactics. He set up a wooden tub, filled it with bottles of magnetized water, iron filings, powdered glass. Then he ran leads from it that the patients could attach to the areas of their body that required attention. Soon there were reports of sensational cures. Often it was reported folks would pass out, then regain consciousness and feel 100% better. Rather dramatic, but all the more captivating. People from all social classes were welcome, provided, of course, that they could pay the fee. Even a member of the Faculty of Medicine from the University of Paris became a convert. Mesmer was back in the limelight. But that, of course, could be a mixed blessing, as he'd already learned. Many established physicians resented this outsider come in to revolutionize medicine. There were soon accusations of charlatanism, not only from French physicians, but also from physicians in German states as the reports filtered into broader knowledge. It didn't help Mesmer that many of the converts in pre-revolutionary days included political radicals who embraced his theory as one more challenge to the established powers. Mesmer himself did not like politics, but his cause was drifting to the left, and he couldn't control it. Now the police became alarmed at the popularity of the Mesmerist movement. They began to keep the Mesmerists under surveillance. And then in 1784, a royal commission was appointed to evaluate Mesmer's claims. It was an impressive group. Lavoisier was in on it, so was Ben Franklin, famous for his exploits in electricity, though he was in France to help negotiate with the French to get support for the American cause against Britain. Another member of the group was Dr. Joseph Guillotine. They looked into Mesmer's theory, did some tests, and announced their verdict. Mesmer's famous fluid did not exist. With this rebuff, and with the movement becoming more and more political, Mesmer soon decided to leave Paris, and eventually he settled in the area where he'd been born and pretty much retained a low profile until he died in 1815. Well, what can we learn from this episode? First, clearly, Mesmer wanted his ideas to be regarded as based on sound mechanical principles. He specifically rejected appeals to occult forces. That was not what he was doing, he said. He claimed that the force he was manipulating was like gravity and magnetism. And I have to tell you that the action of animal magnetism, as we'll see in our next lecture, in fact resembled that of electricity in a lot of ways. It flowed like electricity flowed. The flow could be blocked, and if it was blocked, it would build up, and when the blockage was released, it could produce dramatic, in electricity's case, shocking results. In Mesmer's case, we assume that he was apparently utilizing hypnotic effects, which he had learned how to manipulate, even if he accounted for what happened in his own unique way. Mesmer's behavior, however, violated some of the emerging practices among natural philosophers. After his initial address to the Academy was ignored, for example, he did something that worked against him. He began insisting on keeping the details of his cures secret. He would pass them on only to chosen initiates. And then there was the profit motive. It was only too obvious to his critics. Maybe it reminded them of the alchemists, who also generated suspicion because they seemed to be in it only for the money. In Mesmer's case, he exploited the monopoly he had on his ideas by amassing an excellent income from the group treatment sessions. And of course, the charged political atmosphere of pre-revolutionary Paris accentuated the clash between the powers of the establishment and outsiders like Mesmer, who were trying to join it. This was a remarkable time in Western history. The citizens of Paris were beginning to see themselves differently from the way they had always seen themselves. They were ready to distrust authority and to embrace those who challenged it. This helped Mesmer gain popular support, but by the same token, it virtually guaranteed that those who stood to lose if he succeeded would oppose him. Well, historians of science have explored the relationship between the values of revolutionary France and those that were beginning to be associated with natural scientific investigations. Can we say that natural science is democratic in its roots? There are some ways in which it is. Euclid is reputed to have said that there's no royal road to geometry, meaning that it's not easier for kings or pharaohs, that it's the same for everyone, regardless of rank or social station. But the fact that there's no royal road to geometry cuts both ways. It might be that it can't be made easier for pharaohs, but we can't decide a theory's truth by voting on it either. There's another way that democratic values seem to reinforce scientific practice, at least in the ideal, and that is in the willingness to question authority. We love to tell stories of natural scientists who weren't believed when they questioned the authorities in their fields, and then their ideas eventually turned out to be accepted. For many, Mesmer represents the tendency we see a lot in the history of science to resist the authority of those who claim to be the official spokesman. That doesn't go away, and neither did Mesmerism. It did not at all die with the Paris Commission's report. It continued to flourish on the continent and in Britain throughout much of the 19th century. Of course, a consensus gradually developed in Western society about how science was to be understood and who the authoritative spokespeople were. As that happened, Mesmer's claims gradually took their place with others among the so-called alternative approaches to official science. Well, we came across electricity several times in this lecture. In our next session, we'll examine the new science of electricity, which resembled mesmerism in several ways. But it, as we'll see, was accepted in the Academy.